Okay, well, hello and welcome to this PV Tech Insights webinar. Today, we're looking into the state of the global shipping industry. My name is Sean Roach and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Joining me today is George Griffiths, Managing Editor of Global Container Freight at S&P Global Commodity Insights. As I'm sure many of the audience are aware, the shipping industry has been in chaos since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, with prices fluctuating massively, which has obviously had a massive knock-on effect with global supply chains, and not least of all for solar, given the globalized nature of our industry. So I hope we get into this today, and George can shed some insight and some light into where the industry is headed. Before we start, a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is set to last around 20 minutes and will include opportunities for audience questions. You can use the dialogue box on your screen to submit those questions. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available on demand via the PV Tech site later today. But without any further ado, I will hand over George, who has prepared some slides.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, and it's really lovely to be here. As you said, the supply chain has been in real issues in this last year or so, and I thought, I look at container freight, and this is a perfect forum to sort of go through actually what the issues are, quite how they got so bad, and also what we're expecting to see slightly further down the line from the S&P Global Commodity Insights team. It's worth saying before we start and look at where it all went wrong, we need to take a little step back to the start of 2020. And before that, we had the IMO 2020 regulations, which came in. For those of you not quite as nerdy at shipping as I am, that meant that the sulfur fuel that you could burn in the high seas went from 3.5% to 0.5%. So it was a big step in that way to try and decarbonize the shipping industry, or at least greenhouse gasify it. And this caused quite a lot of increase in terms of rates. As you can see there on the left box, we saw rates really come up. And then, of course, going into 2020, we went into various lockdowns around the world. The COVID pandemic started to strike. And we saw rates come down a little bit. And the reason that I've pulled out these are three of the major trade routes around the world: North Asia to North Continent, and North Asia to Europe, North Asia to East Coast and West Coast North America. And I remember remarking in March, just before we went into lockdown in London, to some of my colleagues on the desk saying, gosh, this was volatility like we've never seen before in the container freight market. That slide I just shared is the very bottom left of this chart that we're seeing here. Little did I know that hindsight was going to be 2020, and for much of this chart was 2020. We've really seen the market change, and it's almost unrecognizable from where it was 2.5 years ago. Just by walking through this chart simply, I mean, we have different routes here. This is North Asia to Europe, to the UK, and North Asia to East and West Coast North America. And what we've seen and transatlantic, of course, what we've seen over the course of this pandemic is rates go through the roof. And it really came from the initial movement, as you can see there in the first half of the chart. There was more demand in the market. We were all guilty, I think, of sitting in our own rooms and looking around and thinking, oh, well, maybe that would be nice if I had a new wardrobe, or the kitchen's looking a bit tattered. And so everybody started buying material things, not able to go to the pub, not able to go to restaurants. People started spending money on materials. So we saw a sharp influx in terms of demand. And this really came to head in the European side, the pre-Brexit stockpiling at the end of 2020. Nobody was quite sure what the UK's trading relationship was going to be with the rest of the European Union. So we saw a sharp increase in demand there as well from all sides. And it's of course worth noting that containers are largely ubiquitous. It doesn't really matter what you're putting in it. What you're paying for is the space on that ship that your container takes. Whether it's solar, whether it's IKEA furniture, whether it's bananas, it doesn't make that much of a difference. You're actually paying for the slot on that ship. And then we started to have outbreaks in ports. Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the gateways into the Americas, really had a big outbreak at the start of 2021. There was a large outbreak in Yantian port, which is just off Shenzhen in China, one of the largest ports in the world. And this tied up a lot of the capacity. So the issue now isn't the demand side, it's really the supply side. But it's important to break that down into two different sides. You have the ocean supply side, and you have the infrastructure, the land supply side. And the ocean supply side and demand are fairly well balanced. There is enough capacity out there to move the goods to and from. Where we're seeing issues, and where these issues are still percolating through the system, is on the logistics inland. People aren't able to move their goods inland from the ports where they're currently sat. this is of course posing a lot of problems. Not only does it mean that your goods are then delayed once they've already been shipped, but it means that it takes longer to turn around those containers, and then they have to be re-exported back. Unlike dry bulk or tankers and some other forms of shipping, when you empty out your cargo, you're left with an empty ship. In the container freight space, you have to take those boxes back to the exporting regions. Otherwise, you end up with an equipment imbalance. That's what we've seen is really been the problem throughout, is that the containers haven't been where they wanted to be. And when they are there, the ports are very clogged up. We're seeing this at the moment, just anecdotally, in lots of ports across the north continent of Europe, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg specifically, where the berths are really full. So all the quayside is stacked up with containers. You can't take more containers off the ships to then free up the space to put the empty containers back on. And so the entire industry is really starting to grind to a halt. As you can see on the right-hand side of this chart, though, the most recent times, freight rates are coming down. And this is quite an important thing to note, given that Shanghai, the largest container port in the world, is currently in lockdown and is expected to be in lockdown until June. That's quite a big worry that rates are coming down because people aren't booking container freight. They aren't booking goods. So where's the demand gone is the sort of the question that comes on from that. And the demand is still there, but largely pent up. But to go through some of these logistical problems and the issues that we're facing, is actually important to look at the vessel queues. So in October 2021, this is just a screen grab from sort of vessel tracking software. This is Los Angeles and Long Beach at the gateway to the US. This is the number of ships that were queuing up ready to unload cargoes. And I filtered this to only look at container ships. And I took a screenshot of exactly the same space in April 2022. And you can see quite how much they cleaned up the issues that were going on there. Because some people were waiting, you wait in the queue for 3 weeks, and then your container finally gets dropped off in the port and it sits quayside for another 4, 5, 6 weeks. And in an age where we can all just refresh on our phone exactly where our cargo is at any given point, watching it sit still in the exact same port is not exactly ideal. And that's one of the issues that we've been seeing. And this really comes down to not only the fact that the ports are clogged up, but the fact that we have a much wider issue in the market, which is there aren't that many chassis, there aren't that many truck drivers, there aren't that many HGV operators, which makes it slower to move the goods to and from ports. And the same with rail cars. As a result of this influx in demand, we're still seeing delays and we're still seeing a lot of demand for rail to move goods away from these ports. This is what Shanghai looks like at the moment. So once again, this is just the container ships that we're talking about here. And I pulled out Shanghai there into a slightly larger blown up image. Shanghai and Ningbo have a lot of container ships waiting off them. And these aren't necessarily small. Some of these are the absolute biggest in the industry, 25,000 TEU container ships. So 25,000 containers that can be sat on them. And you can see the other ports around the Chinese seaboard that are having issues now. Because it's not just Shanghai that's clogged up. Lots of the shipping liners have decided that because Shanghai is having so many issues, then we'll take that one out. We'll go and stop somewhere else. We'll go and stop at Xiamen, we'll go and stop at Yantian, we'll stop at Hong Kong, we'll stop at Shenzhen, Shekou. These are just other ports that we're seeing. And if you look at those 3 or 4 that I've just named there, if you look on the left-hand chart, you can see exactly where they are. That's where we're starting to see delays now, because then you're left with the almost impossible issue of if we drop off these containers in Xiamen, how do you get them from there to Shanghai? Or how do you get them from Ningbo to Shanghai? You have to then truck them up, which pulls on the same resources that we're seeing all the way in all the other ports around the world. So this is an issue that even when Shanghai reopens won't just go away. Because once Shanghai reopens and we see a lot more demand in the market, then that's going to have to be added on top of what we're already seeing. But it's useful to know that schedule reliability does begin to improve, but the void sailings for March and April are still kind of threatening the market. So a void sailing, the container works a bit like a bus route. You have one that leaves Tuesday, one that leaves Thursday, one that leaves Saturday. They stop at 8 different ports on their way and various different containers get taken on and off. And the void sailings in March and April should have given the carriers, the operators, the opportunity to reposition those containers. And to some degree they did, but they're then stuck at the back of these queues that everyone else is seeing. So it's still threatening that overhang of not being able to move loaded goods on those, just moving empty containers. It's then kind of clogging up the system even more. So it's not an easy fix here. We are seeing the average delays come down. So you can see the new line in purple for 2022. And we're seeing the reliability start to rise. But you have to take this with a pinch of salt. Look at the numbers from 2018, 2019, and the first half of 2020. Average schedule reliability, which is, does your shipment arrive within a 12-hour window of when it's supposed to, was pretty high, 70, 80, even up towards of 85%. And now we're talking about things improving from a baseline of 30%. So it's always glib to say things are getting better. The average delay is 7 days, that's a week, just to get to the ports, let alone how long they sit on the inside. So this is an issue that is really, the market's really struggling with at this point. There's no easy solution to it, because every move that the operators make, every move that the ports make, makes it slightly worse on the short term. So some operators are now only taking empty containers back from Europe to the exporting regions across Asia, which in theory makes it easier to then move the goods around European ports, move things to and from the ports. But of course, on the flip side of that, makes it quite difficult to export anything from Europe because they're not taking it, which means that those containers that are loaded are then going to sit on the quayside for several weeks. So there's no golden bullet, or silver bullet, I think it is, from where we are right now. There's no easy solution, because the market is now so fragmented, and the market is having so many knocks. And even just looking back on those first couple of slides about the different things that we can pull up, that we're starting to see real issues. And things started to get better at the end of last year. Coming into January, February, you can see those purple lines start to come down into March as well. But this has yet to be updated for the new data with Shanghai out of the equation. The only thing that really is certain in this industry is that we're going to constantly take knocks. We all remember back just over a year ago now, or 14 months ago, the Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal, and that caused problems for everybody, and it really highlighted the supply chain issues. And we're seeing no matter what efforts people are putting in to try and fix it, something else is coming out of the woodwork, always, to make it slightly worse, to make it slightly trickier. And that then brings us, and I know that I'm sure there'll be questions about it, where are we seeing it? Will we ever go back to pre-COVID rate levels? But I'm not going to give you the answer to that. I'm going to, I think, talk very briefly about, before we do touch on that, about the future in terms of the order book. The order book is how many containers or how many container ships are currently on order, are currently being built or about to be built for the market. And the answer is about 25% of the global industry. So about a quarter of all the capacity out there in the market is going to be added in the next 2 years or so, which sounds great. But once again, the issue isn't on the ocean side. The issue is on the inbound and the land side logistics. So having more capacity at sea, whilst fantastic in some degrees, once the issues die down, won't necessarily fix them immediately. And it's also worth noting that there is new regulation coming in. That means the older your ship, the higher taxes you have to pay, the higher costs you have to pay in order to be compliant with the new regulations that are coming in on carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So if you have an old ship, your easiest way to get around this is to go slowly. If you knock 10% off your speed, 15% off your speed, then you'll be compliant with the new regulations. And these are ballpark figures. Obviously, it depends on a ship-by-ship basis. But if you knock 15% of your speed and you add 25% capacity to it, to the market, are you that much better off? Is supply really that much impacted? To some degree, no. And a lot of people in the market are now starting to view these new build ships that are going to come on, lots of which, as you can see on this chart, are big ships, more than 12,000 containers on them. They're starting to view these ships as almost floating warehouses. Because I think, as we saw over the course of the pandemic, lots of people in this market had adopted the just-in-time delivery system. You need to get your photovoltaics in, so we'll make sure they arrive on this day and they'll be shipped out the next day. And now people are really doing just in case, which is changing a lot of the dynamics that people have inland. People have given up warehouse space, people have given up their truck drivers and things like that. And so viewing these new container ships as floating warehouses as they're coming across the Pacific or across the Atlantic or sort of around the Suez Canal is going to cause some changes back to perhaps the more established way of dealing with the market, but from what we're currently seeing. So the problems are very much not over yet, but we are seeing some improvements, as we saw on that first slide, in terms of rates. But I'm conscious that I don't want to take up the entire time just presenting, and I'm sure that Sean and all of you listening must have questions. So I'm going to pass it back over to Sean for anything here from his side.
Brilliant, George. Thank you very, very much for that. That was a very insightful presentation, which I'm sure the audience would have got a lot out of. So just to remind people, we've now reached the section where we can take audience questions. So a little reminder that you could submit questions using the questions tab on your screen. But firstly, George, I'd just like to ask you, what do you and S&P Global expect to kind of happen to prices moving through this year?
So I was very fortunate earlier on today. I had a meeting with our head analyst on the shipping side, and we were talking about prices over the next 6 months, prices over the next 18 months, and the consensus is things should get better, assuming that you're on the moving goods side, that is. And as prices start to come down, we should see goods flow more easily. But, and this is a big, heavy caveat, not by that much. The market rose significantly at the start of 2020 into 2021. We saw an enormous jump in terms of freight rates, but we haven't seen it show any signs of coming off a cliff. It's going to almost edge down to some degree, slightly imperceptibly. And that's where the Shanghai question really comes in. Are we going to see a huge bullwhip effect in the market where we suddenly see the demand spike, and as a result, rate spikes sort of in line? And that's the big question mark. But further out, we are seeing rates come down, is sort of the long story short. But it will be 5 years at least until we start to see things even vaguely resembling pre-COVID levels. And even then, we're quite likely to be at the top end of what we saw pre-COVID, rather than the range-bound market that we saw before that.
Okay, brilliant, George, and thanks. That was very clear. So I'd just also like to know, given that you expect prices to edge slowly downwards, and albeit there are a number of caveats to that, what would be your advice to importers at the moment trying to negotiate contracts? Would it be to lock in long-term supply arrangements at current prices? Would it be to continue trading on spot market rates until prices come down further, or would there be another strategy that you would advise?
It's a difficult one. It feels to some degree, and I'm sure I don't have to, I'm preaching to the converted here, damned if you do, damned if you don't. It really depends on what issues we see coming up on the horizon. And I think waiting to see what Shanghai brings and whether rates do spike from there should give quite a lot of direction to the market. Lots of the people that I speak to around the world are having some issues where their minimum quantity commitments aren't being seen, aren't being sort of followed through. And the answer is, we don't have space, so maybe you guys should dip into the spot market and try and secure something there. And that seems to be the way that most people are trying to do it now. They're trying to push as much as they can on long-term contracts, with the caveats that it has to actually be moved, that you can't renege on these contracts that some carriers have been accused of doing over the last several years. And I'm not trying to blame anybody in particular. It's been a very difficult time, and I think that's the way that the market is really heading at this point. It is finding that balance between the two different sides of some longer term rates and some shorter term rates. But seeing as the market is generally quite bearish at this point, and it looks like it's coming down, I think people who haven't already locked in long term rates are starting to look slightly further towards the spot rates going forward. Okay,
brilliant. Thanks, George. Another thing is, and especially important for our listeners at the moment, is delays to deliveries, which can obviously affect project timelines and have very disruptive impacts. So I like the infographic you showed earlier about the congestion outside of Long Beach. I'm just wondering what you expect to happen to delays over this year, especially factoring in variables like extended lockdowns and the movement of containers to the ports in which they're needed.
So as we were looking at it, delays are coming down, and they have been for about the last 6 or 8 months, but they're coming down from a very high level. This is the problem with the industry. The problem with trying to make predictions is that it always proves it's a fool's errand in containers, you're always ending up sort of predicting something, and then we have another lockdown or another Suez Canal incident that does that. But we are expecting to see them come down, but there's not really any other option. Any rail cars that people are able to get their hands on going from China, the Belt and Road, all the way up to Europe, they're booked out much longer than any container vessels are at this point. And your only real option is the air freighter. But if you're moving sort of solar panels, that's eye-wateringly expensive and just frankly not an option. And so we are seeing delays come down, but it is sort of softly. I was talking to a client yesterday who was saying in previous years, in order to try and circumvent some of the issues that were happening in the North Europe, in Rotterdam, Hamburg, Antwerp, some of the UK ports, they would move their goods into Romania and Bulgaria through the Black Sea and then truck them up from there. But now with the war between Russia and Ukraine, that's no longer possible for obvious reasons. So it's one of those things that I think the market is starting to adopt the trust the process almost sort of metric of just let's see what happens. Delays are delays, but we'll try and make it as good as possible.
That's a very nice segue into another question of mine is what would be the impact of a kind of protracted conflict as most people are expecting in Ukraine? How much might that cast out across the shipping industry and increase prices and delays?
One of the big things that the war in Ukraine has done is make the oil markets around the world, and specifically for the shipping segment, the bunker fuel prices around the world, very volatile. And when there's volatility there, that's an additional cost onto the container side. Even with freight rates as high as they are, there was a time pre-IMO 2020 where the bunker element was 40% of the overall freight costs. Throughout much of lockdown, that's been almost 2 or 3%, completely negligible value. But we're now seeing it rise back up to, in some instances, 15, 20% of the trade lane is back on the bunkers. So that's just adding extra cost that we're seeing as well. And also you have these containers that aren't able to go to Ukrainian ports, that aren't able to go to Russian ports as well. Which may sound like not the end of the world, but of course you have to remember that there were containers at those ports when the ports were closed, which now are no longer free to move around the supply chain. So we've sort of cut off a fair amount of containers that we were seeing moving at that point as well. So it's almost one hand gives and the other one takes away. The longer that the war goes on, the more pent up demand there's going to be. And also that's certainly when it does reopen, Ukraine being one of the world's largest corn and wheat producers, when it comes back onto the market, is going to require 20-foot containers to move those agricultural goods away. And so we're actually going to see a lot more demand for the infrastructure itself in those ports, which hopefully that will happen soon. There'll be a resolution to the war. But when that does happen, it will pose further issues for this market.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, George. So you've kind of highlighted the movement, almost the backstage infrastructure, the movement of boxes and containers as one of the key drivers of this disruption. I'm just wondering what companies or ports, what measures they're taking in order to kind of smooth out that process and ensure that boxes are where they need to be when they need to be.
So as I touched on earlier, there are some of the container liners are not taking loaded exports from some of the importing regions. So that's North America and Europe predominantly, and are only taking back empty containers to try and deal with what's expected to be a spike in demand as Shanghai reopens and lots of the delays around the Chinese ports start to ease. So that's one thing that people are doing. We're seeing ports around the world, not just in Europe, hiring in a lot more staff to try and do it. And we're also seeing people invest heavily in HGVs, in chassis, along that kind of side, just to try and drive that supply side. And also, this once again tangentially, I was driving down to Cornwall in the southwest of the UK about a month ago or two, and I was driving behind a truck that said, HGV drivers wanted starting salary £58,000, and with the average salary for a household in the UK about £30,000, that's not a bad starting salary. That's how desperate the industry is to fix it. So that I think we're really seeing investment there, investment in port infrastructure itself, and investment in the new container ships to come online to try and ease some of the capacity. Because if you have more container ships, you're able to not employ them to move loaded containers. They can just go through and act as what's called a sweeper vessel, picking up the containers that are in the wrong place and repositioning them as best as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, George. Unfortunately, that's kind of all we have time for today. This is just a little reminder to everyone that's listening that the webinar will be available on demand shortly. George, thank you very, very much again for your time. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you to the audience for their attention. Our next PV Tech Insights webinar will be on the 24th of this month, and we'll explore the roadmap for integration of energy storage into the European power mix. More details on this will be shared shortly. But thank you very much again, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Sean.
Cheers, George. Bye-bye.